People, and we are past 4 minutes past 6. We will start shortly. I know Jonathan is in Boston. It's quite late there. Welcome everyone to DTP Diplomacy Training Program and STARS webinar series on human rights advocacy. The title of the webinar is Understanding Genocide and the Genocide Convention, Genocide Prevention Advocacy Lessons from Recent Genocides. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are hosting this webinar today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We recognize their continuing connection to land, waters, and culture, and pay our deepest respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We also extend this respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Straits Islander people joining us today. We have very promising and very knowledgeable group of people here to discuss this issue. We have Lana Tatour, who is a senior lecturer in global development at the University of New South Wales. She works on Palestine, human rights, settler colonialism, and race. Her co-edited book, Race and the Question of Palestine, is forthcoming with Stanford University Press in June 2025. We also have Debbie Stothard, one of Asia's leading human rights advocates, who is also the founder of ALTSEAN Burma and chair of Innovation for Change. And Debbie was a former Secretary General of the International Federation for Human Rights, FIDH. She has been at the forefront of efforts to prevent genocide, promote democracy, and advance human rights across the region. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Liljeblad, who is an associate professor at the Australian National University College of Law. His research explores the challenges in promoting international norms within developing countries using case studies involving human rights, indigenous rights, and the environment. I'm Mubashir Hassan. I'm a project office coordinator with Diplomacy Training Program. Before I welcome Jonathan Liljeblad to take the lead on the discussion of the webinar today, I just want to explain a few rules of the webinar. First of all, if you have any question and we want you to ask a lot of questions, please type that on in the chat box. We'll pass it to Jonathan, who will lead the discussion and convene the discussion. And also, please be mindful to be respectful in your comment. And this is one of the core objectives of this webinar is really about knowledge production. So we do not have any other agenda here. So let's try to be respectful because some of the issues we are going to discuss may stir emotion. And thank you so much. And with that, I welcome Dr. Jonathan Liljeblad to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Mubashir, and thanks to the Diplomacy Training Program and START for running this webinar. The general orientation tonight is to help the audience gain an understanding of the Genocide Convention of 1948 and get a sense of how it actually operates, and drawing upon the experiences of Debbie Stothard and Lana Tatour to help everyone get a sense of the best ways to apply the Genocide Convention and some of the expectations that we should have in trying to exercise the Genocide Convention. Before we get into the discussion, I just wanted to do a recap of the Genocide Convention just to provide some basic framework to help everyone think through potential questions and to think about potential ideas for discussion later on in this session. The basic information: Genocide Convention created in 1948, came into force in 1951, currently has 153 state parties, and then a number of countries which have signed but not yet ratified the convention. The Genocide Convention basically provides a definition for an international crime of genocide. It is something that has been accepted as a definition in international law. So the definition that's given for genocide in the convention is the same definition that exists in the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court. In addition, I should note that in 1951, the International Court of Justice declared that the terms of the Genocide Convention reflect international norms or jus cogens that reflect the state of international customary law. So therefore, even beyond the terms of the Genocide Convention and beyond the number of state parties, that does have the force of a universal force of international customary law. So the parameters of an international crime, there are two components that everyone should remember. There's what's called a mens rea and actus rea. So a mens rea, that's the intent. So we're trying to address the intent of certain activities. And then there's an actus rea, which is the actual activity that is being criminalized. So with the Genocide Convention, it provides an Article 2, which specifically deals with the components that constitute actus rea. It's anything that involves intent to destroy, either in whole or in part, elements of national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups. And this can include activities like killing, serious bodily or mental harm, anything that brings about physical destruction, any measures that are intended to prevent births, and anything that is related to a forcible transfer of children. So we're going to talk a little bit more with Debbie and Lana about what all of this means. But the other component regarding the actus rea, so when we talk about intent, it relates to actions of genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, the incitement of genocide, attempts to commit genocide, and then complicity in situations where genocide occurs. So that's the actus rea, that's in Article 3. The other component I just want to note in the Genocide Convention is where the trials take place. So this is in Articles 6 and 9. So in Article 6 of the Genocide Convention, that alleged crimes of genocide are to be heard in tribunals in the state where the actions occurred, or in tribunals in locations that are accepted by state parties. In addition, and this relates to the case of the Gambia versus Myanmar, is that disputes between states, between state parties, this is under Article 9, are to be heard in the International Court of Justice. And this includes disputes about the responsibilities of state parties for potential violations of the Genocide Convention. The other thing I'll just make a note of before we proceed to the discussion is Article 4. It very clearly states that it applies to responsible rulers, public officials, as well as private individuals. And so what this means is that the Genocide Convention does not observe sovereign immunity. So political leaders who are currently in office are subject to the terms of the Genocide Convention. Having said all of this, I think now the next stage is to discuss the application of the Genocide Convention, understanding how it works, and managing our expectations about the way it operates. So we're going to turn to Debbie and Lana to get their thoughts. The very first question I'll issue, and this is for both of you, is about how do we recognize genocide? What are the very early stages of genocide? What are the things that people should look out for? Not when genocide has actually occurred, but to recognize the lead up to genocide. And what are the dangerous indicators that things are trending towards potential cases of genocide? So perhaps we'll start with Debbie, then we'll turn to Lana. And then, of course, if the two of you want to respond to each other, that's perfectly okay. So Debbie, why don't you go ahead and start?
Thanks, Jonathan. I hope you can hear me clearly. I think there are a whole range of frameworks, including the framework of analysis for atrocity crimes that helps people assess the level of threat of genocide and other atrocity crimes. A lot of people have criticized this framework because it's not been updated to incorporate an LGBTQ lens and a stronger gender lens. But nonetheless, it's been quite useful because in 2017, we had secret workshops in Rangoon using the framework of analysis, and we followed up with workshops in early 2020 where we used the framework of analysis and the 10 stages of genocide that Gregory Stanton came out with. And we had workshops in Yangon where Muslim participants came from Rakhine State. We had in Pien Uluin, and we had that in Calais in Sagaing region, which is one of the most conflict affected now. And when they sat down and went through this, people were saying, hey, we are still very vulnerable to atrocity crimes, to genocide, to crimes against humanity. Because when we look at the 10 stages of genocide and they looked at what Uriwatu and the Mabata, the Buddhist extremists working in league with the military were inciting, and they were also looking at unresolved conflicts and structural violence, they said, we are in trouble. And they couldn't understand it because they were hopeful that later that year, in 2020, there would be a general election that would bring the second term to the NLD, which everyone hoped the NLD would be much more courageous in terms of policy and action. So we were supposed to do a follow-up workshop in 2021, and after the lockdown was over, but we couldn't. So we had online check-ins, and people were saying, oh my gosh, we predicted this. We predicted this. And we didn't realize we were predicting this. So I think this is something that's quite important when the value of the Genocide Convention is that it defines the basic, the genocide. And later on, the Rome Statute gives us much more clarity in terms of crimes against humanity. So I think for many people, they think of this as an academic exercise, but we were on the ground working with activists on the ground. And what we saw is that women and the LGBT community are the most vulnerable. In many respects, ethnic religious minorities and women, and particularly women and the LGBTQ plus community are kind of the canaries in the coal mine. They are the ones who start feeling the pain first. And this is why we do need to pay attention to what's going on. But having said that, we were concerned about the Rohingya when I helped form ALTSEAN Burma in 1996, we had Rohingya in the room in a regional conference. And I warned the other friends from Burma, well, I'm not going to tolerate you being racist against Muslims and Rohingya. So you just keep quiet. If you need Malaysians and Southeast Asians to actively support the movement, you're going to have to control yourself, and you have to be more accepting. I know it was tough. It was tough talk for me, but we were very concerned about the situation of the Rohingya. But 10 years later, in 2006, as part of a so-called academic exercise, one of our researchers looked at the situation of the Rohingya and compared it to the Genocide Convention. And we were absolutely horrified to realize that the situation of the Rohingya ticked most of the boxes in the Genocide Convention. And we came out with a briefer describing the situation of the Rohingya as a slow-burning genocide as far back as 2006. So this was 11 years before the genocide was sort of so-called officially, there was a genocide. So, it's not a case of early warning as in maybe a few months ahead. We were already worried about this 11 years before the Rohingya genocide happened. So I think I'm going to put in the meeting group chat the PDF of that original document. And, not much has changed, but the violence has intensified, especially as the Arakan army and the junta are clashing and contesting territory in Rakhine or Arakan state, where both sides have committed atrocities against Rohingya. But it's not only Rohingya, it's across the board. We've been really concerned about the fact that the ACLED database, the Armed Conflict Location Event Database, has already acknowledged that in 2024, the conflict in Burma was the second most intense conflict after Palestine. So we're so connected to each other in so many respects when it comes to genocide and crime and atrocity crimes. And in many respects, how genocide operates, who the actors are, their motivations. And of course, we are always very concerned about how companies get involved, how corporations get involved, because a lot of these genocides are resource and wealth-based. They have very strong economic motivation. So those are things that we need to look out for. Thanks.
And then we'll now, thank you, Debbie. Now we'll turn to Lana.
Yes, thank you. Definitely our situations are connected. And I want to acknowledge that I'm joining from Gadigal land, another site of genocide, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I'm gonna, when it comes to Palestine and Gaza, I'll start by saying that history didn't start in October 7, right? And scholars did warn also before October 7 that the siege of Gaza and that may amount to slow motion genocide. So there were these kind of early warnings. And anyone who has been following Israeli rhetoric towards the Palestinian has already identified the process of the deep dehumanization of Palestinians, especially in the last 15, 20 years, which has only escalated with time. And that is, dehumanizing language and hate speech, not just in social media, but also by Israeli officials. And that led to a warning that was issued by the UN Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide and the Special Advisor on Responsibility to Protect, really reminding Israel's responsibility, warning of Israel's conduct, and warning that this may be incitement to commit atrocity crimes. And then immediately after October 7, very shortly after October 7, we had a host of warning that we are seeing what could possibly be genocide unfolding. So already on October 15, we had over 100 scholars of international law, international studies, conflict studies, genocide studies, writing a public letter and warning that we may be seeing the unfolding of a genocide and calling to take the action needed to prevent genocide. We also saw in mid-October the Holocaust and Genocide Studies scholar Raz Segal, an Israeli genocide scholar, writing a piece called A Textbook of Genocide. Again, warning that what we are seeing is these are the early signs of genocide and that the international community has the obligation under the Genocide Convention to prevent genocide. We also had in December scholars of Holocaust, genocide, and mass violence writing a public letter. And in it they wrote, and I'm quoting, "We know that genocide is a process. The time for concerted action to prevent genocide is now, end of quote. And then, of course, we had the ICJ case that was brought by South Africa. And since then, there is an emerging consensus in the international human rights community that Gaza is a case of genocide, from UN experts to international human rights organization, leading scholars in international law and genocide studies. So there's really is a consensus emerging, and that's significant. The hate speech and dehumanizing rhetoric, and I'll say something about that, was really significant. Already early, immediately after October 7, we have seen language used by the highest level of political and military figures in Israel, calling Palestinians human animals, the children of darkness, monsters, and evil to be uprooted. And I'm talking about the Prime Minister, I'm talking about the Minister of Defense, and I'm talking about the President. We've seen, the actions of holding the entire population in Gaza, 2.5 million people, more than half are children, responsible for October 7. It was called, Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, called it a battle of civilization against barbarism. Then there was the trope of Amalek, the biblical, that biblical reference. And everyone who's aware and have knowledge knows that Amalek has to be destroyed. Children, women, elderly, men, everyone. There were calls to turn Gaza into Dresden, dance on what used to be Gaza, and I'm quoting here, to erase and flatten Gaza. Calls to have zero Gazans. And then, of course, we had the intent, and we knew the intent was there. The Minister of Defense said that they will be imposing a complete siege. He said, we will eliminate everything, in these words. And this is what we've seen in Gaza, eliminating everything. And then we have the acts of genocide that we've all saw, whether it's mass killing, destruction of vital infrastructure that sustains life, the use of starvation and dehydration as weapons of genocide, evacuation orders and bombing safe zones and safe routes after ordering the people to move there. And we've also seen the broadcasting of acts of genocide on social media, and preventing birth, which is part of the Genocide Convention, where Israel even bombed Gaza's main IVF center, destroying all embryos, preventing Palestinian lives from ever coming into existence. And then, of course, we have the high miscarriages, and that goes to what Debbie was talking about, the specific gendered dimensions of genocide. I think I'll finish here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lana. And so what we've had now is between the descriptions of events in Myanmar and then events with respect to Gaza, examples that illustrate these activities that can be characterized or identified as genocide. We're going to turn now to the actual application of the Genocide Convention and how we can understand the way it operates with respect to these two examples. In addressing this, the question I'm going to ask both Debbie and Lana is, what can the Genocide Convention do, but then also what can it not do? And so this gets to the heart of what should our expectations be in terms of trying to implement the Genocide Convention or trying to apply the Genocide Convention in the real world cases. So let's go back, I think, to Debbie, and then from there we'll turn it to Lana. So Debbie, did you want to give some thoughts about what our expectations should be about what it can or the Genocide Convention can or cannot do?
Well, firstly, it's important to note that there are more state parties to the Genocide Convention than to the Rome Statute. You know, the Rome Statute has a little bit more muscle and a little bit more, I think, usefulness to survivors, to victim communities. But the Genocide Convention is about 79% of UN members who their state parties have ratified or acceded to the Genocide Convention, including Burma, Myanmar. Back in in fact, many people forgot that Burma and Myanmar was a state party, whereas the Rome Statute is only 65% of member states who have become state parties. And very happy to note that, on that note, that even though the Philippines ratified and then withdrew, it didn't stop former President Duterte from being arrested for atrocity crimes, the mass killings that were conducted under the guise of a war against drugs. So very happy for that as someone from the ASEAN region, and looking forward to more such interventions, including Senior General Min Aung Hlaing and his gang. But one of the things that is really quite important is that because the Genocide Convention has quite a larger number of state parties, you can actually take it to the ICJ. The International Court of Justice. And, you know, for years we were saying, why isn't anyone doing this? And they said, oh, you know, it costs money. You know, which state would, you know, we have to look for a state that's willing to sue Myanmar, blah, blah, blah. Finally, we got the Gambia, and it's going on. It's not able to prosecute or impose criminal penalties like the Rome Statute can. But it actually puts on the table this acknowledgement that a genocide has happened, and looking at who's responsible and why it happened. And we're really delighted at the fact that South Africa actually adapted many of the key arguments on the Rohingya genocide case at the ICJ to intervene on Palestine, on genocide in Palestine. So, you know, it's incredibly important to understand how deeply connected these two ongoing genocides are on various levels, because in the end, genocide is not about the extermination or the intended extermination of one group of people. It is actually, it's not confined to Burma in Asia and Palestine in Swana. It's actually, it is actually deeply connected, because the kind of militarization, the kind of what's going on is really, it's still in operation. So if we look at what can the Genocide Convention do for the Rohingya, it's an acknowledgement that they exist and that they are victims of one of the most terrible crimes that could happen in humanity. And it gives them moral power and acknowledgement in a situation where the military and extremists have not just sought to exterminate them in part or in whole, but to actually erase their identity and their existence in the minds of the world. So this is really important. I think that there's a huge moral power in that. And it helps people have a wake-up call for people. And we're even talking about the genocide of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. A lot of people didn't recognize it as genocide, and they minimized the extent of the problem. But this was a systematic persecution, and ticked so many boxes in terms of the Genocide Convention. And it's a reality check. So we actually have an acceptable international framework that Yep, we've got nasty people running governments who want to disregard it and want to disregard international rule of law, but we still have the moral power that this framework exists and technically is recognized as the red lines we shouldn't be allowed to cross. Sorry, I think I spoke too long there.
No, well, that's fine. So, and let's turn to Lana.
No, not at all. You haven't spoken too much. And, I completely agree with what you said. I mean, the logics, it's really important to understand how the logics of genocide, the acts of genocide, arms trade, the technologies that are being used on the populations, this is absolutely connected in so many ways. Also, the justifications for genocide that are being put forward by the perpetrators, they are like copy paste. So these things really are significant, and we are fighting for, the right to exist. And that to acknowledge that, the acknowledgement that what we are facing is attempts of erasure and elimination. Look, I come to the question of genocide not as an international law scholar. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm a scholar of, international studies. I'm a political sociologist. And I tend to reach the kind of legal framework later in the way that I think about these questions. So one of the things that I want to say is, for the person who is watching the news, who is following the news, when they see a genocide, they know it is a genocide. I mean, it is just follow what is happening in Gaza. It is clear that what we are seeing is genocide. We don't need to be experts in international law. Obviously, then in terms of advocacy, we need to substantiate that claim. And we use the Genocide Convention in order, to foreground the claim and to ask for, accountability and recognition and action and sanctions and arms embargo and whatever it is that you want to ask. But at the heart of it, I mean, we need to acknowledge that we know genocide when we see it. And this is something that is, that is significant. One of the limitations, so, for me, I was watching the genocide unfolding, right? And it was clear that it was genocide. And then there was the ICJ case. And then suddenly the entire legal conversation was around whether South Africa can prove intent. So that kind of intent is really key feature in the Genocide Convention and in basically it will be a central question in the ICJ for the judges, whether there has been intent. And for me, that was quite remarkable, coming to it from, politics and international studies perspective. Because, first of all, we have enough evidence to demonstrate intent. But why is intent and not the reality is what needs to be proven, right? So why is it we're seeing the destruction of all means that sustain life, whether it's hospitals, whether it's schools, and so whether it's infrastructure of water and sewage, the destruction of the vast majority of buildings, of homes, of, Gaza has been turned into a rubble. There is a clear attempt to destroy the Palestinians in Gaza in part or in whole. That's clear. Why is the focus on intent rather than on the reality of genocide? And here I came to the really wonderful work of, the historian, kind of a legal historian, Derek Moses, who, was trying to, who traced the limits of the way in which we think about genocide. And he argued that the convention has been deliberately designed to have a bias towards states rather than keeping the focus on people. And we're seeing it. I mean, the whole idea of proving intent, and that's his argument, is really centering state sovereignty and centering the ability of state to wage wars and to, engage in armed conflict. So what we face, and I believe that this would be the case for the Rohingya as well, is these arguments by the perpetrating states that, but this is not a genocide. This is a legitimate military action that is resulting in civilian casualties and destruction of infrastructure and so on and so forth. So my point is that we need to recognize that the Genocide Convention is first and foremost goes with the interests of sovereign states rather than the interests of the victims of genocide. It doesn't mean we cannot use it, but it means we do need to question its foundations and to push forward the framework, the legal framework, away from intent into recognizing reality and acts of genocide as the determining factor for, the International Court of Justice or other, legal forums, relevant legal forums, in determining whether people are actually subject to genocide. And again, as a legal, as a scholar who's not coming from a legal background, for me, what do you expect? I mean, what you want is the Prime Minister of the State of Israel to come and say, we want to do a genocide? I mean, they said they're going to eliminate everything. No one declares its intention to do genocide in the words of, I'm going to commit genocide. So again, the focus really has to be on actions and on reality on the ground.
So I want to pose a follow-up question based on the comments from both Debbie and Lana. And this builds upon the comments about sort of the moral component, right? And that the Genocide Convention is indicating sort of a moral standard about certain activities, and that for victims, it provides a moral justification of what's happened. But then that leads to the next question in terms of what victims can expect in terms of justice. So for victims who do want to see justice against, political leaders who've been driving the activities of genocide, it's what should victims see or expect? Is there a reality or a possibility of justice? Can we, as a world, can victims have any hope of seeing perpetrators of genocide being brought to some form of justice in a courtroom, any court, whether domestic, international? And would that be under the Genocide Convention, or would it have to be under an alternative means? So, I'll let Debbie answer first, and then Lana after.
Firstly, I wanted to respond to something that Lana said about this very tricky thing about trying to prove intent when we can see the impact. The effect itself is genocide, and we need to see how it has to be victim-centered and not perpetrated-centered. And, in most legal traditions, in most legal frameworks, when an organization or an individual is charged with a crime and taken to court, the main issue is about determining guilt. They don't actually care about your motive. They care that the judge and the judicial system cares about whether you actually committed the crime. So I come from, I'm Malaysian, so we inherited the British colonial judicial system, and it actually doesn't require the prosecutor to prove motive. They just need to prove guilt. And I think I don't understand why that doesn't apply in this case when it comes to genocide. So that's one thing. But going back to justice, it is kind of colonial idea of justice as being a judicial measure that perpetrators are identified, taken to court, convicted, and punished for their crimes. But if we look at victim-centered justice, it goes beyond that. You know, very often when we look at what's going on in Palestine, what's going on with Rohingya, what's going on in many situations of genocide around the world, survivors, they don't say we want this person to hang or we want this person to be punished. They usually say we need safety, we need shelter, we need food and health and education for our children. And in that respect, we need to see justice as going beyond a judicial measure. And the acknowledgement of the genocide, or even the acknowledgement of the identity of the group targeted, is a first step. The second one is actually extending shelter, protection, and restoring something some of what they've lost in order for them to continue surviving. And in this case, this is where ASEAN messes up and falls down very badly. In fact, a lot of states around the region and the world fall down on this because, as far as they're concerned, their view of genocide, guilt for genocide, is very narrow. But their negligence and even criminalization of people who have sought refuge from genocide, who have fled genocide, is the way they criminalize refugees is terrible, because they are actually extending and intensifying and prolonging the impact of genocide on the survivors. So Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia have been quite happy to allow hate speech and incitement against Rohingya and other refugees from Burma to continue and to flourish. There's about, I think, at least 1,500 Rohingya women and children who are indefinitely detained in centers in Malaysia because they're criminalized, but there's been push to stop them from being deported into the hands of the perpetrators of the genocide, the military junta. So now we are seeing this situation that justice is not just about what may happen in the ICJ or the ICC or hybrid court. Justice is about protection first of survivors, and justice is about ensuring that it's not just justice by one body, some elite body of judges. It's actually a collective responsibility. So this is when we talk about responsibility to protect. What we are actually saying to ASEAN states is you don't have to, R2P is not about, in response to genocide, it's not about sending peacekeepers. You don't have to do that. You can do R2P without getting off your ass. All you have to do is allow survivors of the genocide who are staying in your territory to get the protection they need. That's it. Very easy. No need to get up. Just sit there. Let it happen. Tell your police to stop harassing these people. Tell the immigration to stop rounding them up and attacking and raiding learning centers for refugee children. That's unacceptable. So for me, I mean, it's great Duterte has been arrested. It's great that the ICC is investigating, found a way to investigate Burma for the forced deportation of Rohingya to Bangladesh. It's great there's ICJ case, there's universal jurisdiction cases happening in places like Argentina. But in the end, we have to think about the survivors, particularly the people suffering the worst from the impacts of the genocide. For them, justice is not a judicial process. Justice is actually giving them the means to survive.
Well, thanks, Debbie. And then Lana, do you want to follow up with that?
Yes, I mean, the question of justice is a really significant one. Debbie has addressed how it needs to be, survivor focused, right? And, in the context of what is happening in Gaza and now also the West Bank, because violence has escalated and similar practices that have been, used in Gaza are now being used in the West Bank. With tens of thousands, being ethnically cleansed from their homes, where there's, destruction of infrastructure, where they're being prevented from returning to their homes, and so on and so forth. I think the immediate question of justice, especially in relation to Gaza, is we haven't been able to prevent this genocide. And it's still ongoing, despite, the early warning signs. That wasn't enough to stop genocide. Then we started seeing the genocide escalating and escalating. Every time there were different red lines put forward by, the US administration who was committing the genocide together with Israel. It's a joint genocide. But, we've seen international community putting red lines, no to hospitals, no to, no to bombing hospitals, no to the evacuation of Rafah, northern Gaza. And every time we've seen those red lines being crossed. So there is still a genocide ongoing in Gaza. I want to remind that now for the probably 10th or 12th day, Israel is preventing the entry of food, medicine, etc. into Gaza. And again, starvation is being used as a weapon of genocide. So the first question, the immediate aspect of justice, is the failure to prevent the genocide in Gaza. Despite, and where actually justice is taking place, it is at the level of grassroots mobilization, where the demands for justice are being put forward in a strong way, where, boycott, for example, is being practiced, and so on and so forth. Now, Debbie said something really, really important. You can still, you don't have to send troops to protect. You can sit, sorry for my language, on your ass and, prevent genocide. This genocide could have been prevented with cutting the weapons supply to Israel. Israel has no capacity to commit this genocide on its own. There was a continued stream of weapons coming, especially from the United States, but not only, Canada, the UK, Germany, and Australia. Even though all these countries, the entire international community, is under obligation not to take any measures that can aid the genocide. They're under obligation under international law. Sanctions, cutting trade ties, prosecuting dual citizens who serve in the Israeli army, committing crimes of genocide and coming back to their country. I mean, there are so many different steps that could have been taken to stop this genocide, which haven't been taken. And this is why 16 months, if not more, and we are still, this genocide is ongoing at high speed.
So thanks for that, Lana, and thanks for the insights from both of you about this meaning of justice and, how do we understand it? I think we're going to open things up now for question and answer and get some thoughts from the audience and then allow both of you to respond to the audience. There was 2 questions, I think, that dealt with culture. So I'll raise those before I forget. There was one question that drew upon Article 8 of the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which deals with attacks on Indigenous culture. And then there was another question that specifically asked about, to what degree or what extent is cultural genocide a form of genocide? Legally, in the history of the drafting of the Genocide Convention, culture was originally part of the draft, but then it was removed before the final version was enacted in 1948. So I think this is an open question as to how we deal with issues of attacks on culture. So either one, Debbie or Lana, I don't know if who wants to answer that question.
Debbie, maybe? I think Debbie would be better.
As a feminist and an ally of the LGBTQ plus community, I believe that culture is something that grows and changes. Like all of us, how we practice our culture is defined by us, by the members of the group. So I think cultural genocide is part of erasure of the identity. It is part of the genocidal process. I was quite shocked to hear something on social media, an assertion that Israelis were calling themselves indigenous to Palestine, when that was not the case. But this kind of cultural trying to insert their claim indigenous identity and indigenous culture to justify genocide of Palestinians is quite shocking and quite devious. So I think the shifts in culture, how culture evolves, is actually up to the group, to the particular community, whose culture that is. And it shouldn't be an imposition from external forces or an erasure of that culture. It is very much part of the genocide process, but I think in this day and age where people are much more concerned about acts of physical violence, about structural violence, which includes cultural genocide, but also includes much more terrible threats to food security, weaponization of aid, and forced displacement. And in many cases, whether it's Aboriginal people, whether it's indigenous people groups in Burma, Myanmar, and even Palestinians, where land was taken away from them and they were pushed off their own land, their cultural identity, and in some cases their religious identity, is tied to the land. So that is really, it's not just saying you can't dance like this, or you can't dress like this, or you can't cook this particular food anymore, or you shouldn't use your language. It is something more intrinsic and much more hurtful at the core of many indigenous cultures, that in many indigenous communities, that culture is very much an expression of their identity. For many of us, like me, I'm so mixed, and I see myself as part of being drawing on so many cultures. It's not so critical, but when the group is so small and so much under threat, then we do need to actually stand up against cultural genocide and cultural appropriation that is used to erase a particular group's identity.
I'd say that, there is quite a bit on, that kind of physical genocide versus, cultural genocide. And it's important also to remember that both of them are interlinked, right? But I wanna, I want to talk about one aspect of cultural genocide in relation to Gaza that we often don't talk about. So what happened in Gaza was a complete destruction of cultural heritage sites, of mosques, of archives, of churches, some dating, some heritage, cultural heritage sites dating hundreds of years and some thousands of years. Nothing, universities, schools, nothing is standing. And again, archives of municipalities. I mean, we are now in Gaza without archives, private archives. But also there is the aspect of families, the archiving, the personal archiving of families, photo albums of generations, right? Being completely destroyed. Personal, official documents, also dating generations back that families kept, being destroyed. Videos of weddings, videos of different, cultural celebrations, videos documenting the kids, and it could be generations back when there was no phones, right? Documenting kids doing shows in, cultural centers and schools. All these also, those kind of small documentation of family life that are part of the, our lives. Think about, what we are documenting at daily level, right? Are gone. So really, there has been an attempt to completely erase any trace of Palestinian existence in Gaza, from things that are grand and big to the kind of quotidian daily lives that we see.
So we have another question from the audience that I think addresses another facet of this conversation about genocide. There was a point about the recent attacks in Syria upon a Christian sect by former soldiers or former members of the Bashar al-Assad regime. And it gets to this question about non-state actors involved in activities against other groups of people. So everything we've addressed so far in discussing the cases of Myanmar and then Palestine, Gaza, has been about activities of states or state actors and the leaders of the state in fomenting activities of genocide. But I'm curious for both of you, Debbie and Lana, if you have thoughts about can we identify or can we say that the Genocide Convention applies to situations where it's a group of non-state actors attacking another group of people? So we're just curious on your thoughts on those. So I don't know who would want to go first, Lana or Debbie.
Lana, I've been speaking first. I think you should speak first this time.
Yeah.
I actually don't have a question for that, right? That's a legal question, but as coming from perspective of politics, why not? I mean, the whole kind of state-centric approach to understanding politics and international law is limited. We know that the nature of warfare has changed. We know that there are more actors involved in wars, in civil society, and so on and so forth. So at principle level, I don't know what the legal conversation around this is, but at the most basic level, law needs to catch up with reality. And it might be that a particular group will be subject to genocide by non-state actors. And also often states may mobilize non-state actors to do the dirty work. So we always, with law, we always have the situation of law needing to catch up with reality, right? It's always behind. I'll take this opportunity and Ghassan Shaheen is saying, I believe, Lana, you are barking up the wrong tree. The dilemma, it goes back to the US. I have stated during this talk more than once that it is a US-Israel genocide. This genocide could not have happened without the US. Obviously, imperialism plays a big role, but I just want to set the record straight that I have addressed it multiple times during this webinar.
I would thanks, Lana. I think there's a couple of things that we need to understand, and under international frameworks and international rule of law, even though the perpetrator of a genocide may be a non-state actor, the state in which this is happening is expected to ensure protection of civilians. And if it is unable or unwilling to do so, this is where other states need to do something through they need to comply and implement their responsibility to protect. So in ultimately the state authorities are responsible for what happens in their territory, even if those territories are disputed. But in many cases, Lana also pointed out, sometimes states do use non-state actors, armed groups, local armed groups as their proxies, so that they have a certain amount of deniability. When we look at what's happening in many cases of genocide and atrocity crimes, those bodies, those armed groups were allowed to exist and even receive support from state authorities before committing those crimes. So I think, trying to use non-state actors as kind of an alibi or an excuse to deny responsibility. The thing is that ultimately the state does have responsibility over what happens in their territory. And I'm not a lawyer, but it's been drummed into me quite often that when it comes to any kind of international crime, it is the state. The state has to weigh in. They have an obligation, and if they are unable to comply with, to fulfill their obligation, their duty to protect, then they do need to actually seek help. So that's basically what it's about. And going back to U.S. complicity in the genocide of Palestine, the Palestinian genocide, in 2022, the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York actually mounted a court case to sue Biden and Blinken, so the president and the U.S. Secretary of State, for complicity in the genocide that was unfolding in Palestine. And this is an NGO, a legal NGO in the U.S., and they worked with Palestinian Americans who had the right to sue their president and their Secretary of State for complicity in genocide. ALTSEAN's very proud of the fact that we were the Asian organization on the amicus brief. And we basically, and our claim was that we work on atrocity prevention, and we are in a region where there are Palestinian refugees, so we have a right to be on the amicus. We have a stake in the case. The case has not been able to proceed, but the judge allowed the Palestinian Americans to testify about what was going on the ground. So I think, we do need to recognize that genocide is not conducted by one perpetrator, that the perpetrator is supported by networks who give them the means to commit genocide and protection to continue their impunity. And then there are other forms of complicity, which is neighboring states and states not wishing, even criminalizing survivors of genocide. and not giving them the protection that they need. So when we talk about justice, part of the justice is that they, we should we shouldn't be looking at justice as something that happens after the genocide is over. Justice is preventing and mitigating the genocide at the very beginning in every stage.
So I'll follow up on that comment about the mitigation, prevention of genocide, and draw in another question that comes in from the audience. And I'm going to exercise moderator's privilege to modify this question just a little bit. But the question is dealing with, about early warning systems, quote unquote, for genocide. And I'm interpreting that as everything that we've discussed about the Genocide Convention is about states, and the action that was brought to the ICJ by Gambia versus Myanmar was a state action against another state. But having said that, within the international community, and I mean that generally in terms of the entire population of humanity, can we have some kind of a system to identify genocide, before it happens, to articulate and call out actions that we believe are leading into genocide. And so in other words, that people are not waiting for states to take action. We're not waiting for the Gambia to take action, but that non-state actors, the larger international community can do something for things that in the future might be considered genocide of some kind. So once again, I'll open that up for either Lana or Debbie, in terms of, if either one of you or both of you have thoughts about that.
There's been a number of organizations that have started to explore and set up early warning systems for genocide and atrocity crimes. And the most famous one is started by the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Even if you just look at the Genocide Convention and you see something is happening, there are systematic human rights violations that already perpetrate one element of the Genocide Convention, it's already a red flag. But we also have the UN Framework of Analysis on Atrocity Crimes, which has it actually explores some indicators for atrocity crimes, and they have a specific section on genocide. And if you look at in some respects, systematic persecution of a group within the community, like women or LGBTQ plus community, or even persons with disabilities, are already an indicator that something is wrong. So there are a number of red flags, and just go online and check it, because they do have different groups concerned about this have already raised this. And then when we look at, interestingly, there are other conventions, like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, where cultural genocide is actually covered in there, where the child's right to culture and its especially indigenous children's link to land and nature, attacks on that is an attack on the child. And then also the general comment number 16 on the convention actually has very clear guidance on how companies need to be conflict sensitive. So both the convention and general comment 16 really look at protection of children in situations of atrocity and conflict. So we do have so many entry points if we go and look at the language, that we can't. Many people say, oh, they're not Rome, they're not state parties to Rome Statute, too bad, there's no solution. But there are very many solutions, and this is where civil society academics and people who are really committed about this, they build a raft of protection. They go through so many entry points. There are frameworks that are in place. And the issue is about generating political will. If our governments don't do it, we have to raise our voices. It's the solidarity of international civil society that has made the changes in the first place. It was international civil society that worked to establish the International Criminal Court. So I think it is absolutely important to understand we are not powerless in this situation. It's very easy to feel bitter that there are big governments, big money, big corporations siding with the perpetrators, big media silencing what's going on and hiding what's going on. But, we still have the tools and we still have the will to work together in solidarity to challenge and to push back, because that's where real change happens. If we're going to be complacent and get depressed and not do anything about it, this is where the other side wins, where genocide is normalized.
So this brings up, there was a question that was specifically for Lana, but it does bring up a related question about attempts by states to smother, discussions or speech by non-state actors about genocide. So specifically, this is the current efforts of the Trump administration to deport a protester who was arguing or debating or making statements about genocide in Gaza. And I think this was at Columbia University. I might be wrong on that, but anyway, so this is dealing with the question about, when states are smothering speech or conversations about allegations of genocide. So Lana, that question was meant for you specifically. So do you want to go ahead and respond to that?
Yeah, I'm going to relate to what Debbie said. I mean, people on the ground who work with communities, who live the reality, who do grassroots work, they know this is coming. I mean, it never catches them by surprise. The problem is we're not listening. And I've heard that from so many people, from so many different conflicts, trying to lobby UN officials or, in UN administration, and they don't want to listen, they don't want to hear, so they don't need to act, right? So the problem is not just, identifying the early signs. We actually do quite good work quite good job in doing this. The problem is the political dimension and the political will to act on these early signs. And I think we rarely see international action or political action when we identify these early signs. And then there is obviously, when we have the signs and genocide is happening, and a denial that genocide is happening, which is in the case of Gaza, right? Genocide is not happening. And that links to the question of, all the political suppression that we're seeing. This is not only a US phenomenon. The US obviously is doing it in extreme ways, especially after Trump, but this is not this is unfortunately a phenomenon in Western countries. So the situation in Germany is really terrible. And, also in this country, we're seeing growing suppression of Palestine speech, Palestine protests, censorship in universities, and so on and so forth. And what is concerning is, today I've been reading, so just in the last 2 days, right, I woke up to several events, academic events canceled on genocide in Gaza in the US. Talk at Stanford Anthropology, another talk that included Israeli and Palestinian scholars, the deportation, the detention and the possible deportation of the Palestinian student leader at Columbia University, Mahmoud Khalil, and A Palestinian who works at Yale Law School has been targeted and suspended. This is just these 2 days, right? And the problem is, I've been reading some of these cases, some of the reporting on these cases, and literally there has been this kind of sentence repeating itself that pro-Israel groups or, pro-Israel Jewish groups arguing that accusing Israel of genocide or saying that Israel is committing genocide is anti-Semitic. And the problem is that, as I said, we have a consensus emerging in the international human rights community that genocide is happening. And then we have Western countries who are claiming to be the guardian of the post, Second World War international liberal regimes and the human rights regime, as their guardians, actually completely undermining the international human rights community, and on the contrary, suppressing any speech and any conversation on genocide. So it's genocide denialism, but we are now also in a stage where there are attempts at all to prevent any conversation on genocide by claiming that genocide, which is racially motivated, that arguing that Israel is committing it is an act of racism by those who dare to raise it. And that again goes back also to the place of the Holocaust as this kind of, archetype of what genocide is, and how can you accuse, the victims of the Holocaust in committing genocide, right? Because apparently that gives an impunity, right? A blank check. So the situation, in terms of conversation on Palestine, Palestine is receiving a lot of international attention that other contexts are not. But it's also receiving repression of political speech that also other contexts are not. So there is that kind of duality there.
And Debbie, you had your hand up. So
Yeah, firstly, I wanted to add to what Lana is saying, because it's been easy to target Palestinian academics and activists when they speak out. And while we need to protect the right of survivors to speak about what they're going through and to speak against the atrocities that they and their families and their communities are facing, there has to be some solidarity. There has to be people in the mainstream community willing to speak up as well. It's easy for repressive bodies to single out the survivor community and try and shut them down and persecute and cooperate with basically what is the transnational repression of the Netanyahu regime. But there has to be a willingness in Australia of other Australians to speak out on what's going on in Palestine. And in the same way, Rohingya are being subjected to hate speech and criminalization in ASEAN countries, and other ASEAN citizens need to speak out against what's happening with the Rohingya. And I have one small criticism, and this was that in Indonesia and Malaysia, there's double standards. There's a lot of support for Palestinians, whereas Thailand is anti-Palestinian. They're pro-Israeli because they're pro-American, and Thai guest workers were taken by Hamas. So they're actively cooperating with the US and Israel. But, in places like Indonesia and Malaysia, some of the Rohingya community sought help from Palestinian refugees to say, please speak up for us, or please, stand in solidarity. And there was a reluctance to do so, mainly because Palestinians I would suspect, feel so vulnerable in other parts of the world. They're afraid to lose the protection that they could get in Indonesia and Malaysia. But I think we do need to have a willingness to speak up. Citizens of whichever place need to have the willingness to speak up in solidarity. Otherwise, Palestinian survivors, Rohingya survivors, and survivors of the Sudanese ongoing genocide and other genocidal situations around the world will continue to be suppressed and persecuted. So I think this is where whether we are academics or activists or just general members of the public who have a sense of justice and fairness, we do need to speak out.
So thanks to both of you. I'm looking at the time, and we're approaching the 90-minute mark, and we needed to allow a little bit of time for Yasmina to give a summary and introduction regarding the START series. But I want to extend thanks to both Debbie and Lana for your comments and your insights. And so I ask the audience to please provide a round of applause for both speakers. If there's a way of the audience to contact you, perhaps you can provide some contact information in the chat space, and then people can reach out to you with their specific questions. So once again, thanks to both Debbie and Lana. Now we're going to turn over to get some information about STARTS, and this is to help everyone in the audience understand more about the program, how it operates, and the support for these webinar series. So Yasmina, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and thanks to everyone in the audience.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I don't think I'll be talking much about STARTS, but I did want to thank you for your able facilitation today. I'd like to thank our partners in diplomacy training program who have brought our ability to increase capacity of refugee-led organizations and leaders in the area of advocacy, particularly international advocacy, to a new level. So Patrick, Mubashir, Claire, thank you very much. And then, of course, absolute thanks and our gratitude to Debbie and Lana. Thank you for your insights. Thank you for your analysis. Thank you for your humanity. You know, it goes well beyond. It goes well beyond legal understanding of genocide. The things that you've shared with us, and for me, as someone of Bosnian background, where a 30th anniversary of genocide will occur this year. And my community's engagement with international law and justice systems, I appreciated listening to you today. So that's the thanks. And I wanted to say that we will actually continue running these webinars. We will email you. I believe Claire will be in charge of emailing the feedback form. So please let us know what you thought of tonight. We'd really appreciate that. We are going, this is one of the 3 series of webinars we'll be doing. The next one will be looking at the UN accountability mechanisms. So I think next week, we have the first one of those. And then we'll be looking at Magnitsky legislation, which is targeted sanctions, and how those targeted sanctions can be understood and used or approached to in Australian context. So I think that's about it from me. I'm not sure. Thank you again for being here, and thank you everyone for joining us and listening tonight. We look forward to seeing you the next webinar. Over to you, Mubashir.
Thank you, everyone, and we're closing on this moment. I thank you all of the panelists, especially Jonathan for waking up too late, but it also shows the commitment for people. I wish you all have a good afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and thank you, and see you in the next webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you.